She said, "I'm going to protest downtown. Don't wait up." I said, "Be safe." The next day, I sent the bail money to her friends instead of her. The note I included made her entire group turn against her. I, 32M, watched my wife grab her jacket from the coat rack near the front door, her movements quick and purposeful. She told me she was heading to protest downtown and not to wait up for her. I nodded, told her to be safe, and watched her leave without looking back. The door clicked shut, and I sat there on the couch, staring at the spot where she'd been standing moments before. We'd been married for 6 years. Good years, or so I thought. She was passionate about causes, always had been. Environmental issues, social justice, workers' rights. She threw herself into everything with an intensity I'd once found attractive. But lately, something had shifted. The protests became more frequent, the late nights more common, and the distance between us grew wider with each passing week. That night, I couldn't shake a feeling in my gut. Something fell off. She'd been secretive with her phone recently, angling the screen away when I walked by, taking calls in the other room. I noticed her texting more, smiling at messages in ways she hadn't smiled at me in months. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Around midnight, I checked her location. We'd always shared it with each other, a safety thing we'd set up years ago. She was downtown, just like she'd said. But as I watched the little dot on the map, it didn't move toward any protest route or gathering spot I'd seen on the news. Instead, it stayed stationary at what looked like a residential address. I felt sick. I opened my laptop and searched for protests happening that night. There were none scheduled. Nothing. Not downtown, not anywhere in the city. The dot stayed at that address until 3 in the morning. When she came home around 4, I pretended to be asleep. She showered before sliding into bed beside me, and the scent of unfamiliar cologne mixed with her shampoo made my stomach turn. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing, piecing together months of small inconsistencies that suddenly made terrible sense. The next morning, she seemed nervous. She moved around the kitchen making coffee, avoiding eye contact. I asked her how the protest went, keeping my voice casual. She told me it was intense, that the police had been aggressive, that she and her friends had barely made it out without getting arrested. She said they'd stayed at someone's apartment afterward to decompress, which explained why she'd been so late. I nodded along, watching her lie to my face. Every word she spoke dug the knife deeper. I'd married this woman. I trusted her completely. And here she was, spinning an elaborate story about a protest that never happened, about police that were never there, about friends who were probably just as fictional as the rest of it. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from her best friend, asking if my wife had made it home okay. She mentioned something about bail money and asked if I could help coordinate getting everyone out. My blood ran cold. I asked what she was talking about. She sent back a confused message saying that several people from last night's protest had been arrested and were being held on minor charges. She assumed my wife had filled me in, but my wife hadn't been arrested. She'd been at that address all night, which meant her friends had actually gone to a protest, a real one, and she'd used it as her cover story. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. She told me about the protest because she knew her friends were actually going. If I checked with anyone, if I asked around, I'd hear about the protest and believe her story. It was the perfect alibi, except she'd gotten sloppy, hadn't checked in with her friends, and didn't know some of them had actually been arrested. I sat down on my laptop and started digging. I found the protest she'd supposedly attended, a workers' rights demonstration that had turned tense when protesters blocked an intersection. Several arrests had been made. Her friends' names appeared on a bail fundraising page that had been set up early that morning. The bail amount needed was substantial. Between 5 people, they needed about $4,000 to get everyone out. The fundraising page had raised maybe $600 so far. My wife came into the room and asked what I was doing. I told her I was just checking the news. She seemed satisfied and went to shower. While she was in the bathroom, I transferred exactly $4,000 to the group's fundraising account. Then I sent a message to her best friend, the one coordinating everything. I told her I was sorry to hear about what happened at the protest. I said my wife had come home safely and told me all about it, about how she'd been right there with them until the very end, about how terrible she felt that she'd managed to avoid arrest while her friends hadn't been so lucky. I mentioned how she described the police aggression in detail, how shaken up she'd been by the whole experience. I said that while my wife was sleeping off the exhaustion from such an intense night, I wanted to help her friends who'd sacrificed their freedom for the cause. I added that I was covering the full bail amount, because that's what my wife would want, to support the people who stood beside her in that intersection, fighting for what's right. I included screenshots of my wife's location history from the previous night, showing her at that residential address miles away from the protest site. I mentioned I'd noticed the discrepancy and was concerned there might be some confusion, and perhaps her friends could help me understand where my wife had actually been while they were being arrested. I sent it before I could second-guess myself. Then I waited. The response came within 20 minutes. Her best friend called me instead of texting. I could hear the fury in her voice when I answered. She asked me point-blank what I was trying to pull. I told her I wasn't trying to pull anything. I'd simply shared what my wife had told me and what the location data showed. I said I thought there might be a reasonable explanation and hoped her friends could clarify. There was a long silence. Then she told me they'd been asking my wife to join them at the protest for weeks. My wife had said she couldn't make it, that she had a work thing she couldn't get out of. When her best friend texted her during the protest, my wife had responded saying she was so sorry she couldn't be there, that she was stuck at a late meeting. After the arrests, my wife had gone radio silent. Her friends had assumed she'd gone to bed, exhausted from work, having no idea what they'd been through. Now they knew she'd lied to everyone. She'd lied to them about why she couldn't attend. She'd lied to me about attending. And she'd apparently tried to claim credit for their bravery and sacrifice. Her best friend's voice cracked when she asked me where my wife had really been. I told her I didn't know for certain, but I had my suspicions. I said I was sorry to drag her friends into whatever was happening in my marriage, but I thought they deserved to know the truth. I told her the bail money was genuine, no strings attached, because what her friends did took real courage, and they shouldn't suffer because my wife was a liar. She thanked me quietly and hung up. My wife emerged from the shower, wrapped in a towel, smiling. She asked if I wanted to grab brunch somewhere. I told her sure, whatever she wanted. She seemed relieved, like she thought she'd gotten away with it. Her phone started buzzing almost immediately. Text after text, call after call. She frowned, picking it up. I watched the color drain from her face as she read. Her hands started shaking. She looked at me, her eyes wide and panicked, and asked what I'd done. I told her I'd helped her friends make bail. I thought she'd be happy about that. She asked why I'd sent those screenshots, why I'd told them what she'd said. Her voice was rising, becoming shrill. I stayed calm. I told her I'd only repeated what she'd told me and shared information I thought might help explain any confusion. I said I'd been worried when her location didn't match her story, and I'd hoped her friends might have some insight. She started crying, saying I'd ruined everything. She tried to explain that she had been at the protest, that the location data must be wrong, that her phone must have glitched. But the lies were flimsy now, desperate. I asked her whose address that was. She couldn't answer. I asked her who she'd really been with. She kept crying, kept insisting I was misunderstanding. I told her I wanted a divorce. She broke down completely then. She admitted she'd been seeing someone from her activist circle, someone she'd met at a planning meeting months ago. She swore it had only been physical, that it meant nothing, that she loved me and wanted to work things out. She said she'd made a terrible mistake and begged me not to throw away 6 years over one stupid decision. I asked her how many times. She wouldn't say. I asked her how long. She said 3 months. I asked if she'd used protest cover stories before. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Every late night, every passionate speech about justice and solidarity. Every time I'd admired her dedication to making the world better, she'd been using my trust and her friends' genuine activism as a shield for an affair. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Her entire friend group was turning on her. The messages I could see on her screen were brutal. They called her a liar, a narcissist, someone who'd weaponized their real activism for her own selfish purposes. They said they'd put their bodies on the line, risked arrest records and legal consequences, while she'd been off sleeping with someone and then tried to claim she'd been there with them. Her best friend sent a particularly scathing message saying she'd never forgive her for this betrayal. Others piled on, saying they'd always suspected she was performative, that she'd always made everything about herself, that now they finally saw her true character. The group chat she was part of, the one coordinating all their activism, went silent to her. Someone removed her from it entirely. I watched her social circle disintegrate in real time. The people she'd spent years cultivating relationships with, the community she'd built her identity around, they all turned their backs on her within hours. The bail money I'd sent had bought her friend's freedom and destroyed her reputation simultaneously. She looked at me with absolute hatred and asked how I could be so cruel. I told her I'd only told the truth. She'd created this situation entirely on her own. I just illuminated it. Update 1. The divorce papers were filed within a week. My wife moved out and went to stay with her mother, since none of her friends would take her in. Her affair partner, as it turned out, was also in a relationship, something she apparently hadn't known. His partner found out through the same social circle and ended things immediately. So my wife lost her marriage, her affair, and her entire community all at once. I got messages from a few people in her activist group thanking me for the bail money and apologizing for what I was going through. They told me stories about times my wife had taken credit for work she hadn't done, about how she'd always positioned herself at the center of every cause without doing the actual grunt work. They said they'd excused it because she was charismatic and good at recruiting, but now they saw it as part of a larger pattern of dishonesty. One person told me my wife had been bragging about me, about how I made good money and supported her activism financially. Apparently, she'd positioned herself as this selfless activist whose supportive husband enabled her important work. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. My wife tried to reach out several times. She sent long emails explaining her side, saying I destroyed her life over a mistake, that I'd been vindictive and calculated in how I'd exposed her. She wasn't wrong about that, but she seemed unable to grasp that she'd destroyed her own life. I just refused to be complicit in covering it up. Her mother called me once, asking if we could work things out. She said her daughter had made a mistake, but didn't deserve to lose everything. I asked if she'd feel the same way if I'd been the one cheating and lying. She went quiet and then hung up. The divorce was uncontested. My wife didn't fight for anything. I think she knew she had no moral ground to stand on. We split assets fairly, and I kept the house since I could afford the mortgage alone. She took her car and her personal belongings, and that was it. The last time I saw her was when she came to collect the last of her things. She looked smaller somehow, defeated. She asked me if I was happy now, if destroying her had made me feel better. I told her I hadn't destroyed her. I just stopped protecting her from the consequences of her own choices. She left without another word. Update 2. 6 months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that my ex-wife had moved to another city. She tried to integrate into the activist community there, but apparently her reputation had followed her. Someone from our city's group had connections and word had spread. She couldn't escape what she'd done. I also learned that several of her friends who'd been arrested that night had their charges dropped entirely. The bail money I'd sent had been returned to the fundraising account, and they'd donated it to a legal defense fund for protesters. They sent me a thank you card signed by everyone, saying my support had meant more than I could know. I started dating again, cautiously. I'd learned to pay attention to inconsistencies, to trust my instincts when something felt off. I'd learned that love without honesty is just a comfortable lie, and I'd rather be alone than live in that kind of deception again. Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh, if I could have handled it differently, more privately. But then I remember the look on her face when she lied to me that morning, the ease with which the deception rolled off her tongue, and I know I made the right choice. She didn't just cheat on me. She weaponized causes that mattered to real people, used their genuine passion and sacrifice as props in her betrayal. The protests she never attended, the friends she exploited, the trust she shattered. It all revealed who she really was beneath the performance. And once I saw it clearly, there was no going back. I don't regret sending that money or that message. I regret that it took me so long to see the truth. But at least now I'm free of it, and so is everyone else she was deceiving. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop enabling someone's lies, even if it feels cruel in the moment. Especially if it feels cruel in the moment. Because the cruelty isn't in the exposure, it's in the betrayal that made exposure necessary. The protest she never attended, the friend she exploited, the trust she shattered. It all revealed who she really was beneath the performance. And once I saw it clearly, there was no going back. I don't regret sending that money or that message. I regret that it took me so long to see the truth. But at least now I'm free of it, and so is everyone else she was deceiving. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop enabling someone's lies, even if it feels cruel in the moment. Especially if it feels cruel in the moment. Because the cruelty isn't in the exposure, it's in the betrayal that made exposure necessary.